Welcome to the No Budget Indie Filmcast, where we dip into the independent film universe so that you don't have to. Will you agree with our panel, or will our panel agree with each other? Tune in to find out. I am the one and only Mila Dennison. Joining me is the one and only Claire Milan.
Hello.
Joining the two of us is the third and only Cathal Feeney.
Hello.
And fourth, but not last, joining us is filmmaker Jules. Shit, I just remembered your last name too.
Charlton.
Charlton.
Just call me Jules. It's easier.
Charlton. How do we
Or should we say cinematographer Jules is really... I think
whichever.
So he has brought us a fantastic film we're going to look at today. Cathal, what are we seeing?
All right, so today's film is called Next Floor, and it's directed by Denis Villeneuve, who's a French-Canadian director. People might know him from films such as Arrival and the latest iteration of Blade Runner. So the film Next Floor is kind of a surrealist, kind of dark film. What you have is a load of kind of middle-aged men, mostly men, some women, sitting down for a meal, and it's a table. It's like sort of one of those old meals you might have had, like the Knights at the Round Table or something. You know, all these exposed bones and meat and flesh, and it's very kind of gory looking, and they're just gorging themselves on this, and they have their waiting service and their little band playing, and so they're eating away. Next minute, the floor gives way beneath them, and they, go down into the next floor, and it continues on like that. So that's what the film is in essence. Now it is obviously there's a kind of a hidden meaning to it, I guess. So we can find out, or we can give our own opinions. So there we are. So I'll pass it on to Jules now. He can talk about it.
Yeah. So I the way I found this film was I actually went onto Screamfest because I wanted to sort of highlight a movie that was basically in the horror gothic genre, and I'd gone through a number of movies on Screamfest, which they're running films at the moment, and this thing popped up in my YouTube feed, and having watched a number of horror movies and independent horror movies, which seemed to start off with sort of spooky music and then went into an interminable, reverse shot discussion to try and set up the film, this thing popped up. And what struck me first of all is it's almost entirely silent. It's one of Denis Villeneuve's last, I think, short films before he made Prisoners, which was the movie that rocketed him to really superstardom, because he did Prisoners, and then there was Sicario, and then there was Arrival, and then there was Blade Runner and the glory of Blade Runner 2049, and obviously everybody's waiting to see what he's going to do with Dune. What's interesting about Next Floor is that when we step into it, it starts with the maitre d', and it starts on an extreme close-up of the maitre d's eye, and he's looking right, I think, screen right to left, and then it pulls out, and then it pulls back in. And yes, you're right, Carl, these strange, grotesque characters, most of them in uniform. And as the film progresses and you get a chance to look at them one after another, they start to sort of represent authority figures in different countries. So there's one guy that looks like a Russian dictator, like a Tsarist dictator, and there's one guy who looks like kind of a Nazi figure. And for some reason, there are three, I'm not saying this because my head is shaved, there are three men sitting in a row, and they all have shaved heads, and they're wearing these sort of Stalinist uniforms. And I kind of thought, oh, that's like a kind of a cliche that's come into movies in the last 20 years, that everybody who's slightly villainous in a movie has to look like A-lister Crowley. So anyone who's listening to this podcast who knows who A-lister Crowley is, you know, and it's become kind of a trope. You see it in Hellboy, and you see it in a lot of other movies. But basically, that's the way the movie starts, and they are eating this food, and it becomes clear as you're watching the film that a lot of the things they're eating, it's all meat. There's no vegetables, there's no fruit. As the movie progresses, which is only 11 minutes long, and they're eating this meat, you realize it's all endangered animals. It's rhinoceroses, it's aardvarks, it's anteaters. It's kind of, in a way, the kind of animals, what would be called bushmeat, that have really sort of brought the world into the weird dystopian place that it is now. And as they're gorging in the first scene, the floor gives way, as you say, and they drop to the next floor. And the film is kind of recitative. It's like music, that every floor they descend to, the musicians and the maitre d' and the servers of these weird meats go to the next floor. And as they eat more, their descent between the floors becomes faster and faster. And that was something I missed when I watched the film for the first time, was that actually they've already descended a number of floors. We're coming into this kind of in the middle, really, of the film, in the middle of this story. So there's some floor above where they started. We don't find them there. And as they descend to each floor, the film gets visually darker and darker and darker, until the maitre d', as they're going down the back stairs, has flashlights. It's a very interesting film. My personal view of it is, it's kind of like an MC Escher drawing. It's not a horror, it's not a gothic, but it's almost entirely silent, and it relies to a huge extent on sound effects and the visuals that you see in front of you. And the other thing that I thought, which struck me as very interesting, was this was not the first film I came across. I went through a lot of short horror movies, either in Screamfest or things that popped up, and they always seem to do too much. They always seem to have too many locations. There seemed to be too much dialogue. They seem to cram too much into 10 or 11 minutes. And you also saw, the other thing that struck me was, in a lot of those other movies, which will remain nameless, is you also felt that they were trying to hold back this big idea that they had, and they weren't really luxuriating in their mise en scène. Whereas in this film, you know, Denis Villeneuve is not trying to hide anything. He's sort of going, here it is at the start, and I'm going to show it to you again, and I'm going to show it to you again. I'm going to change it. And in a way, it was a pleasure to see a short film where the filmmaker is not trying to hold back really important information. He spreads all the cards of his deck right out on the table at the start and says, I'm going to show you a trick, and I'm going to show it to you again. I'm going to show it to you again. And in a way, it's almost like a comedian, a stand-up comedian, telling a joke. And every time they tell the joke or the punchline, it gets funnier. And here it gets darker, and it gets more morbid. So that's sort of my opening gambit for this film.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the simplicity of it, because we talk about this quite often on this podcast when we watch short films, and often the ones that we dislike are those ones where the filmmakers try to cram too much into it. And this is very simple. You know what he's trying to tell you with the disgusting food on the table, the characters sitting around the table. It's subtle, but it's also very clear, if that makes sense. And, he's not just blasting it, but it makes sense when you see the people eating this disgusting food, and just the sound and the visuals of it. And and coming from Denis, that makes sense. I mean, you watch his other films, they're also very visual films. And as much as I think a lot of people didn't like the latest Blade Runner film, I actually liked it and thought it was really well done, because of the way he is as a filmmaker. And that definitely came through in this particular short, I think.
It was kind of funny because I watched it earlier as I was preparing my lunch, so I had my lunch ready to go.
Good timing.
I sat down and watched the film thinking, oh yeah, but I'll watch this film. and oh god, it put me off my lunch completely. Do you know what I mean? But what struck me was I loved this kind of start, and there's a kind of nearly a dance to it, like a rhythm, the sound of them eating, and it was like nearly there's a beat to it, you know. But it was fascinating, as you said. It's like telling a joke again and again. It gets funnier and funnier. It just gets darker and darker. And like I didn't expect the floor to keep giving way. It's like as if they're kind of going to hell or something. Do you know? It's
Yeah.
like they keep going down, 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 but it's very dark and grotesque, and it's like they're eating humanity or something. There's a metaphor in here. It's like they're gorging even when they're full. And there's one guy and he can't eat at all, and he has like a feeding tube in his nose. You know, he's just sitting there, but I didn't expect to watch a film like this today, you know. But it's almost like, you can see the picture behind Milo as well. It's like a painting as well, like a lighting in it. It was very, very dark, grotesque.
Yeah, it was
It
interesting.
was.
I noticed the dust on their jackets and stuff right away, the white powder, and
Yeah.
with the way they were acting. I thought, my initial thought was this was some kind of purgatory where, like, you know, evil dictators go when they're dead, or bad people go and just, you know, gorge on dead and uncooked animal. So it was interesting when they fell through the floor to answer, like, okay, well, that's
And that's what I thought as well. It was like purgatory, and there's one woman in it, and she stops eating for a moment, and she kind of
for a
looks
second.
around.
Yeah.
And it's like she's like really, you know, she's observing them, or she's like just kind of thinking, oh, this is horrible, but then she eats again, you know. But it was this lovely moment in it, like really, like it was. There's so much detail in it. I think I'll have to watch it again to find the detail in it. You know,
Yeah.
it's one of
It's
those.
definitely a film. Yeah, you need to probably watch a few times. Like visually, it was very striking, and so one thing that struck me as well, like how we kind of ritualize and sanitize actual eating when it is actually quite disgusting, you know, or in a way barbaric, you know, the way we kind of we kill animals and eat them. But I did get that sort of idea that they were sort of descending into hell, and if I was trying to think, okay, what could it mean? And some may thought maybe it's a sort of it's a criticism of our consumerism, you know, the way we're constantly consuming, you know, not just like the planet really around us, and even as they go down floor by floor, and they have this moment of kind of reflection, you know, should we continue, you know, even though, you know, it's getting worse and worse and worse, but they just can't help themselves. They just, you know, we can't help ourselves as people, you know, we just.
And the fact they're eating the young as well, it's like they've eaten everything, and then it's like the little, I don't know what they are, chicks or something that haven't been born yet. It looked like, you know, and it's and in one moment as well, the floor didn't look like it was going to fall, and then it started shaking a little bit. Like it was just. There was like moments like that in it that were like, oh god, this is just really strange, you know, but also grotesque to look at.
Yeah. I wonder with this film, because I've been watching Frank Miller's Netflix series Cursed, which is a sort of a retelling of the Arthurian legends from the point of view of the Lady of the Lake. And one of the things that really struck me about that and strikes me about this is, to a certain extent, I wonder how much of an influence Monty Python has had on serious filmmaking and not just comedy filmmaking, because there's an element of the Mr. Creosote episode in Meaning of Life in this short. You know, Mr. Creosote is like, oh, would you like a wafer thin mint? And it doesn't matter how much he eats, he wants to eat some, as you were saying, eat some more. And there's an element of that in Cursed as well, that it's very hard now, I think, to do an Arthurian legend film with knights, and somehow, you know, Monty Python and Michael Palin, that whole kind of satirical edge that they brought, somehow can't edge its way in. And of all the films I was thinking of when I watched this, the one that really struck me the most was Monty Python. And they're not people that you imagine have had a massive influence on contemporary cinema, but in a funny way, I think their influence is a lot bigger maybe than people imagine. And in this film, I think as you were saying, Carl, I think it's quite an important influence, even though Villeneuve is not playing this for laughs. You know what I mean? Creosote is pure satire, and this is something much more malevolent.
It's funny because I watched that Monty Python Creosote, is it? Creosote.
Yeah,
But I watched it recently because I hadn't seen it before, and it was mad. Like it's so grotesque, the scene, you know, and he keeps eating and eating and eating, and there is influence in this film. You can
Or
definitely see
even
it. Yeah.
now that you mentioned it, you're totally right. Complete Terror Gilliam, Time Bandits, for example, is very much like this. I think in a lot of ways, or a few scenes in Time Bandits, anyways. Or yeah.
That,
and certainly.
go ahead, sorry, Jules.
No, go on.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I don't know, I think it was Claire, you mentioned that one character who had the tube, but he was the only person of color, I think, in that
That was interesting.
table, you know. And I wondered what, like, did he, you know, what did he represent? I don't know if anybody else had a thought about this.
I was one.
Go on.
Sorry,
I just think they just put him in because they were like, wait a minute, don't want to. So
filling out of form. I thought there was an element there, though, that he was sort of bringing in that whole thing of, because there are dictators in developing countries, you know, and you know, whether he wasn't letting anybody off the hook. He was sort of saying, oh, you know, there are dictators here and there and everywhere, and as you're saying, they all look like dictators. You know, they all have the epaulets, and they all have the medals, and looking at you there, Milo, you can see it in that wide shot. You know, they all look amazingly villainous and villainous from the early 20th century. You know, like those three Crowleyites. There's sort of a mixture of the Addams Family and the opening of Hellboy with those guys.
It's interesting.
But I mean, maybe that character, like he's slightly, you know, recessed from the table, and maybe he's some sort of victim in this. Like he's being dragged down everybody else. Sorry.
Well, it's interesting because when they fall, they're covered in dust. I think one stage really like heavy dust, and then they start brushing it off, like they're renewing something. Maybe just a symbol in that, or just something. But it was there's so much to it. Like, and it's interesting that the waiter kind of smirks at one stage. He gives a little kind of really kind of, you know, when he's observing all these people gorging all his food, and he has a really kind of evil little smile. Do you know, there's something in that as well.
So here's the question: do you guys think they eventually get to a bottom, or do they just keep falling?
I think they keep falling. I think it's like, for me anyway, it's like purgatory. It's like these people if they are dictators, which now looking at the picture that they look like dictators, it's kind of like they're in purgatory and they have to keep reliving this over and over. I think it's a bottomless pit.
Yeah, I think they probably go to hell, but I mean, I think I think in a way they represent all of us.
Well, it's definitely, the filmmaker telling us something about like the society we live in and the people that run it, and, you know, the consumerism and destruction of nature, and, you know, even just plain old meat eating, that kind of stuff. So, and the ones in charge, the waiters work, you know, the rest of us working for the people sitting around the table, like, yeah, it's all there for sure.
And it was actually a great use of the chandelier because it added a bit of an effect to it. So when
it's great,
isn't it? It was just amazing because I think when they fell, like really fell, the chandelier just went flying. Like it was just a lovely after, you know, really added to the sense, like how far they were going, you know. So
I also I should say that this film, it's the first production of a young producer called Phoebe Greenberg, and she came up with the conception as well. So, you know, it's a very interesting melange between her ideas and Denis Villeneuve's ideas, you know, in the sense of that it's two authorial minds coming together and sort of, you know, exploring a particular idea. Yeah, I thought I love that whole thing of everything getting progressively darker. There are less windows. The light that they produce is the light that they produce is not as strong, you know, and there's this, as you were saying about the maitre d' giving a smirk, it's not entirely clear with the staff how they feel about their clients, how they feel about the people there. And they're certainly determined not to go down, to hell with them, that's for sure. And yet they're chained to them, because every time they hit a floor, they have to go down to a lower floor.
And even they're playing instruments as well, which is kind of spooky. It added to it, like they were playing a song and then to stop and to run down and catch up, you know. So that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, shades of Titanic.
Yeah, it was.
It's you know, what's that foie gras? It's like their foie gras, like, you
They're
know,
being
Yeah.
stuffed.
they're
Yeah,
stuffing
yeah.
them, you know, really knowing what their destiny is. Yeah.
And it's like a team effort to try to break the floor. You know, it's because one of them stops eating and then they look at it. You know, it's like, we're not heavy enough. Quick. But it's like it's like a nightmare of eating your favorite food but being forced to eat it all the time. Imagine, like,
Yeah.
beyond being stuffed, you know, it's like torture.
Mm.
That's right.
All right, guys. Ratings. Who wants to go first?
I'll give it a 4.
Yeah.
A high 4. I mean, 5 would be like, I would say if it was a 5, then it would be the most, you know what I mean? Then cinema would stop, but cinema hasn't stopped. So on the basis that cinema is still continuing, and Denis Villeneuve's Dune is probably his next greatest film, 4.
People hope.
Yeah.
People hope.
Yeah.
I think I'll give it a
Well,
4 as well. Yeah, so I just think, yeah, it was really dark and interesting and fascinating. So 4 as well for me.
Well, I've stopped cinema a few times with my rating, but yeah, I'll give it 4 too. I think it's a film I'm definitely going to watch again, you know, a couple of times, because I think there's a lot in it, and yeah, it is a very visceral film, you know. So yeah, 4.
I was gonna go 4, but now I'm not going to, because you all did 4s. So I'm going 3.5.
Oh, okay. It's interesting. Actually,
Okay.
when was this film? When was it made? Was it a few years ago?
2002. Well, yeah, it was made 2008, but it only went online about a year ago.
Oh. So it didn't do the festival
So-
run or anything like that.
Oh, it did a ton of festivals.
Did it?
Done a ton
Yeah,
of
it was
festivals.
in,
Awards and everything.
yeah, it was in
Oh.
Yeah.
SIF, it was in Cannes, it was in
Okay.
Sundance. Like, yeah, it was everywhere.
It was a great calling card for him, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, talk about going from a career of shorts to features. I mean, that's a
Yeah.
nice jump too into this features that he's done.
And was out of the success of this that he jumped into features? Was it like, this is the one that really launched his career?
I think he'd done a number of features. Oh, no, sorry.
Number of shorts.
He had done a number of shorts,
Mhm.
but I think there was this one, and then he did one in the interim, if I can get my IMDb right, and then he did Prisoners, and Prisoners was the one that launched him, because it was his first real feature with Jake Gyllenhaal. And then, I mean, it was like kind of a small independent movie, and yet at the same time, you know, you were seeing it on bus shelters, and then, you know, the next thing was Sicario. So he was a director that, once he moved into features, was moved in conclusively into features that had stars and that had decent money behind them, and he was dealing in a big canvas, you know what I mean. So, and what's interesting about him is the first 2 are thrillers, and if you were to look at Sicario or Prisoners, you wouldn't say, oh, this is the director who's going to be now seen as the big sci-fi director. And it was really Arrival that made him, I suppose it was Arrival and Blade Runner that made him the big sci-fi director in America. And, you know, but you wouldn't have, I mean, you could look at this film. I think it's sometimes interesting to look at a director's early films, or maybe the short films they made just before they become a big successful director, or they break through, as to really what it is that they really want to do, you know what I mean? And this has sort of got this morbid, I mean, I looked at this and I went, yeah, I can see how he would end up directing Blade Runner, but not necessarily how he would end up doing Sicario, because Sicario is much more of an action thriller I mean, it's very dark as well, but it's a very different kind of film, you know.
Yeah, it's true. Cool.
Alrighty.
All right, guys. As always, if you want to let us know what you thought of this film, you can do it via the comments, via a review, or, of course, via our social media channels, which are at No Budget Show on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Thanks again to Jules for joining us this week and bringing this film to our attention. We appreciate it. And with that, we will say see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Carlton?
Charlton.
Charlton. So I was right the first time. That's unusual.
Don't mind him, Jules. He's terrible with names.